Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Clifton Corridor Transit Initiative public meeting. We know that this is a very exciting time for everyone in the region in regards to this project, and MARTA is excited to provide you this evening an update on the project. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Next slide. All right, so as you all know, we are using Zoom, the Zoom platform that I'm sure everyone is used to these days. But what's unique about this feature is that we are using the Q&A feature. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A. That is where all attendees can enter questions. We would like you to hold your questions to the end of the presentation so that during the Q&A session, they can be addressed in order to allow you time to listen closely to the presentation, which is likely that your questions may be answered during the presentation. Also, to avoid background noise, we have muted all microphones except for the speakers. In addition, we have a closed caption option as well. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a closed caption option that you can press, and you will see text to accompany the audio. Well, this evening, we have Brian Hobbs, who will be our presenter from MARTA, and I am your host, Content Terry, a member of the planning team. We have subject matter experts and MARTA staff along for this journey as well to address your questions during the Q&A portion of the program. Since everyone is muted and videos are off, except for the speakers, we want to acknowledge a few elected officials that we see that have logged on. We have City of Atlanta Council Member Alex Wan joining us this evening. We have DeKalb Commissioner Michelle Longspears on as well. All right, with that, I want to thank you all for joining this very important meeting this evening. We anticipate hundreds will be joining us over the next few minutes that have not already joined. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Brian Hobbs to start the presentation.
All right, thank you, Content. All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, evening. It is a pleasure again to be here to be able to provide you with an update on where we are with the Clifton Corridor project. Last time we came out, we talked to you about reducing the alternatives down from 10 to 3. And we had to go through an alternative analysis process of screening those alternatives and getting to a point where we can bring things down till we can get to a point where we can go to the MARTA board and adopt a new alternative. So what we're going to do today, we're going to provide you an update on the Clifton Corridor Screen 2 analysis process. We're going to present the Screen 2 alternatives and the initial evaluation results and give you a little bit of feedback on what we've been doing over the last couple of months. Here you see the agenda: project overview and status, Screen 2 alternatives, evaluation update, alternatives comparison, and then we'll talk next steps. So the first slide here, you've seen this before. This basically gives you an overview of the project. So again, this being a proposed high capacity transit service through a major regional employment and institutional corridor. If you may remember, we eliminated Decatur Station as a terminus station for this corridor, and now we go from Lindbergh to Avondale Station. What you see new on this map would be the dashed line, which is the additional connections under consideration. And that would be our Decatur Station option, which is currently slated to be ART, and then a VA Medical Center shuttle, which at this point we are also considering. So again, that's just an overview. You've seen this before, and we'll go to the next slide. So this current phase of work, again, we're still in alternative analysis, but we're getting to that point where we're really ready to recommend an alternative to the MARTA board. And so our goal with this process, again, is to select that recommended alternative for adoption by the board and then proceed into the environmental review process with the FTA. So we're evaluating project alternatives at multiple stages and screenings, which we did. As you can see, in December, January timeframe, we had the 10. Then we came back to you, and then we narrowed things down to the 3 after we got feedback from you. And so for today, we're going to talk about those 3 alternatives and what we're seeing from those 3 alternatives and where we're headed next on our journey towards the recommended alternative for the MARTA board. So before we get into the analysis, what I want to do is give everybody a refresher about the modes that we've considered for this project. The first mode, as you can see here, is ART, or arterial rapid transit. We also considered BRT, or bus rapid transit, and LRT, or light rail transit. What you see on the screen here just gives you different characteristics of each mode, just to remind you that mixed traffic is usually how we implement ART, where bus rapid transit and light rail transit are usually dedicated right away, is how we usually implement that. The average station spacing between the two, similar between bus rapid transit and light rail transit, with half a mile's radius. And then you start talking about ART, we can go from a quarter of a mile to half a mile. Typical peak frequencies, as you can see, similarities between the bus rapid transit and light rail transit, where you have the arterial rapid transit at 15 minutes or better. Capacity is a little different as well. Obviously, arterial rapid transit, you will get less riders per hour because it's a smaller vehicle. It's only one vehicle, where bus rapid transit, you have the ability to have multiple vehicles or cars, similar to light rail. And then you start talking about the time frames, the difference in the time frames it takes to implement these projects. One thing you will notice here, we do have planning, design, and construction included in these time frames. And that's why you get a 3 to 5 year time frame for ART, a 7 to 8 year time frame for BRT, and then a 8 to 10 year time frame for LRT. Now, I will say this is specific to Clifton corridor because we have seen this before on other projects. But we've taken into account the Clifton project on its own and put this characteristic chart together for you. A little bit more in depth about arterial rapid transit. You know, we heard a lot about not wanting to expand upon a right of way, but also wanting more transit in certain areas of the corridor. In particular, that's why the Decatur arterial route to Decatur is something that we looked at for being ART. And so again, with ART, we typically do not take any right of way. We're using the current travel way when we're implementing ART. And then we have some different amenities. ART is a lot faster than our regular bus service. As you see, 15-minute peak frequencies or less. It does operate in mixed traffic. Again, so it does not take right away. Unique transit line and vehicle branding. So our ARTs are typically branded differently from our local bus service. Station amenities are typically more upgraded than our local bus service. And then transit signal priority, which for traffic signals to assist the bus in getting through the traffic signals in an efficient manner, is usually implemented with ART. So that's a little bit of a synopsis or characteristics of what ART is when we talk about that. And then how is it different from our local bus service? It's faster service, but no right-of-way is typically taken with that service. This slide talks about the alternatives. These you have seen before. These are the 3 alternatives that we have moved forward with through this process. As you can see, the green line represents alternative 1A, which is BRT with dedicated guideway and lanes from Lindbergh Station to Avondale Station. That's BRT service from station to station from one point to the other end. And so you get the same thing when you look at 1B. 1B is in the blue. Now, 1B, the only difference between 1A and 1B would be the arterial rapid transit line that we are right now have slated to go to Decatur. Now, we call it an arterial rapid transit right now, or ART, but we are still evaluating this, and you know, it could be some other form of additional service, but right now it's slated as ART, but we'll continue to look at that. Then you have alternative 2, which is in the orange. Alternative 2 is our light rail with dedicated guideway lanes. Again, this is from Lindbergh Station to Avondale Station. And so when you look at the three alternatives, they all really end at the same location and take very similar routes. The only difference being alternative 1B has the additional line going down to Decatur. Something you haven't seen in our previous presentation is the minimal operable segment. So this segment of the locally preferred alternative is one area that provides the most cost-effective solution with the greatest benefits for this project. The reason we are looking at a minimal operable segment is because at this current time, we only have dedicated funding right now from the City of Atlanta through the More Model Atlanta program. So that is our only right now funding that we have that we know from a standpoint has been committed to the project. And so that leaves us with having to look at keeping the right of way or keeping the project within the city limits of Atlanta at this point, while we continue to identify funding sources for the cab. I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of each of the alternatives. So this is alternative 1A, as you can see. And again, this is BRT from end to end, from Lindbergh to Avondale Station. So if you look at the time frame from a characteristic standpoint, it's 31 minutes to travel from Lindbergh to Avondale Station, where typically in peak hours by Google, what Google is saying, it takes 1 hour and 15 minutes by car usually to make that same trek. So all the way from Lindbergh to Avondale, 31 minutes with the BRT. And if you're driving at peak time, about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So that's a very big difference in time savings there. 97% dedicated right away when you're talking about the BRT and for 1A. Also, when you start looking at the number of people you touch within a half-mile radius of the stations, and this is 2020 numbers, you touch about 39,000 or 40,000 individuals around the stations. That's a half-mile radius around the stations. Same thing when you look at jobs. Now, these are 2018 numbers because it was before pandemic. There's 34,400 jobs around the half-mile radius of the stations. So as you can see, very busy area, populated with a lot of people just around the state, a half-mile radius around the stations. Similarly, BRT with dedicated guideway, Lindbergh to Avondale, same thing as alternative 1. The only difference again here is that we are now considering an additional connection going down to Decatur. And right now it's ART, but it could be something different. But as you can say, it is an additional connection going down to the Decatur station based on what we heard. Similar to characteristics from a time frame standpoint, 31 minutes travel time from Lindbergh to Avondale. But what you do see here differently is that 27-minute travel time from Lindbergh to Decatur station, even in mixed traffic. What you're seeing there is in that shorter time frame is mainly due to the fact that it is a shorter route, where the BRT route is a little longer. So you are anticipated to get to Decatur station a little faster than you would the Avondale station. Combined, this is about an 84% dedicated right away. Again, the difference, as you saw earlier, there's no difference in the BRT right away, being that it's 97%. However, you do have a difference because you're going down to Decatur station with the ART. So when you combine that, you get an 84% dedicated right away percentage. Similar numbers around the half-mile radius of station. You do get the additional people and additional jobs because you do now have that additional service. So as you can see, you can touch around 47,000 or 48,000 people within a half-mile radius of the station, or somewhere around 42,000 jobs within a half-mile radius of the station. The next alternative and the characteristics we'll discuss are light rail. So light rail, again, similar alignment to our BRT alignments. But as you can see, a 29-minute travel time from Lindbergh to Avondale. So that's from end to end at 29 minutes. Now, light rail transit typically is 100% dedicated right away due to the speed at which you're traveling. So 100% dedicated right away when we talk about the light rail. 39,900 people within a half-mile radius of the station, so almost 40,000, similar to BRT. So you'll have the same statistics because it is the same alignment, essentially. So you have 34,600 jobs within a half-mile radius of the station. So you get similar statistics when you look at the BRT route and the LRT route. So one thing I do want to touch upon before we move on into comparing the modes and comparing the alignment. If you look here, we want to talk about the Federal Transit Administration's New Starts or CIG program, Capital Investment Grant Program, where you have new starts and small starts. So there is a criteria that right now that it is used when you're evaluating these projects. You can get up to, what's been adjusted, is you can get a federal share up to about 60% of the total project costs. And so some of the things that we're looking at, if you can see in the orange box, what Marta is evaluating each of these alternatives on, or really what's in the orange box. The green there is local financial commitment. We kind of talked about that earlier, being right now we only have funding from the city of Atlanta and still identifying funds in DeKalb County. But the goal is to achieve the highest possible rating from the FTA to win the federal grant money for the project. Right now, this project would fall on the New Starts category, and that's what we would go after for this project. But so in comparing these two and deciding on which, deciding on which of these alternatives would move forward, they're pretty similar, as I talked about before. They're similar in a lot of the characteristics and things of that nature. But what really stood out is what we start talking about, mobility improvements, as well as cost effectiveness. Those two things really separate the alternatives, and you'll see that here in a few minutes. And that helped us with regards to understanding which of these alternatives needed to move forward based on which of these projects we could actually have a great potential to receive federal funding. So this next slide gives you some more comparisons. Most of these numbers I just spoke about when you start talking about the middle of this chart and the modes. And so you see the lengths as well from alternative 1A being 8.41 miles, same thing for 1B because they're similar. Alternative 1B 6.6 miles, and then alternative 2 8.16 miles. So if you look at this, we talked a little bit about the dedicated right-of-way. As I mentioned earlier, the BRT alone is 97%. That is 1A. And so you can see 1B is similar, but then 1B, where you have the ART route. So the ART route goes into 77%. And so now you talk about 84% combined when you combine those two. Alternative 2, which is 100% right away, as we talked about earlier, and then the jobs and populations we spoke about as well. What we didn't talk about was the affordable housing units served. Obviously, 1A and alternative 2 are going to be similar because they are similar alignments, so they touch same areas. Whereas 1B, you do have a difference, an increase in the amount of affordable housing units you do serve because of the ART or additional service branch going down to Decatur. These numbers do include the VA Medical Center shuttle, which we have included regardless of the alternative. So this slide gets a little bit more into the different characteristics or the different things associated with the alternatives. So if you look here from the travel time standpoint, we talked about this a little bit. You really see no difference. You see 30, 30, 27, 29. That's not very much of a difference from a standpoint of travel time between the different alignments and modes. Schedule reliability, is very high on all the BRT and light rail. So for all three of the alternatives, including the alternative 1B, the reliability is high, and that's due to the fact that we have dedicated right-of-way. So the dedicated right-of-way increases that ability. And that's why those times are the way you see them. You do have a medium with ART because we do get into mixed traffic with the ART. So that did come in at a medium. Capital costs, now these are $2031, but if you look at the numbers from the standpoint of cost, you go from $900 million to $1.3 billion in $2031 for 1A. And then for 1B, you're looking at $1 billion to $1.4 billion. And then for alternative 2, you're looking for $2.4 billion to $2.9 billion. So you can see the difference there from a standpoint of cost. Now, majority of this cost, or a lot of this cost, is attributed to the fact that there's infrastructure. There's a lot more infrastructure for the light rail system than it is for the BRT. One thing you have to think about is a maintenance facility. Another thing you have to think about the track ballast and so forth, electrification and things of that nature. It just requires a lot more infrastructure for the alternative or light rail alternative. And so that's why you're seeing that huge cost difference right now. Same can be said for annual O&M costs. If you can look at alternative 1, we're looking at about 7.7 to 8.9 million annual operating costs, 12.9 to 14.9 for alternative 1B, and then 22.3 million to 25.7 million for alternative 2. So again, when you start looking at the difference between these alignments and modes, you start to see the difference really stand out when you start talking about cost. Travel time, reliability, similarly. So they're similar. And so when you start thinking about, so what's really different about these modes right now at this stage, it's really the cost. They're 2.5 times higher. At the LRT2 is 2.5 times higher than our alternative 1 or alternative 1B at this point. So that brings us to the similarities and what's different. And so when you start to think about the BRT and the LRT similarities, dedicated right-of-way share, the share of dedicated right-of-way are similar. We talked about 97% for BRT in the end, and we talk about 100% dedicated end-to-end for LRT. So not much difference there when you start talking about the right-of-way share. Travel times and schedule reliability, very similar. We saw 30, we saw 29 for LRT, 30 for BRT. Again, you're talking 1 minute difference here. So not much difference when you start talking about times and travel reliability and scheduling. Projected ridership. So what we're seeing initially right now, we're seeing some comparable numbers. We are not releasing ridership just yet because we are still working on the model, the FTA. It is a new model. So we're working with the FTA on this model to ensure that the inputs and outputs are correct we make sure that that's something we are comfortable with when we're putting in these numbers, because it is a new model. And so with anything new, there are growing pains with it. And so right now, we're not ready to release any ridership numbers, but when we come back, we will be talking ridership again at that point. Clifton BRT and LRT differences. So if you look at the differences, I kind of talked about this a little bit. So alternative 2, the LRT capital operation and maintenance costs, we talked about this a little bit. It is 2.5 times higher than alternative 1A, which is strictly the BRT, and has the longest projected implementation timeline. So that's a difference there that you can see, a glaring difference you can see between the two different modes. Alternative 2, LRT offers no direct service from Lindbergh to Decatur, where we're looking to do that from Lindbergh to Decatur with the BRT. And then alternative 2, you have the lowest anticipated cost effectiveness of the 3 alternatives. If you remember, I pointed out earlier from the FTA perspective, from the criteria perspective, it showed that cost effectiveness was one of those criteria of 16.66% of that criteria. And so because this project is from a standpoint, has such a high cost compared to the other projects, which have similar characteristics, it does have the lowest anticipated cost effectiveness of the 3. Now, alternative 2, so is least likely to receive the federal funding and implementation, because it would be the one where least likely that we can get to that medium that we desire. And so those are some of the differences between BRT and LRT. And so where does that leave us? So that leaves us right here where we're talking about alternative 1A and 1B are the only alternatives that we will advance going forward. alternative 2 is no longer under consideration, or light rail is no longer under consideration for the Clifton corridor. And so we will continue to evaluate alternative 1A and 1B to determine, and basically, again, the difference is to determine if we should add an additional leg down to Decatur and how that would operate. But as it stands today, alternative 2 or light rail is no longer an option for the Clifton corridor. This slide here, just to talk a little bit about what's going on with this project as far as what we're going to be doing moving forward. It gives you a little illustration as well of what we talked about earlier from a standpoint of where we have funding at this point. So again, 1A and 1B will be the only alternatives that we move forward with. And then we talked about this a little earlier, the minimum operable segment, something that we're right now, we're real keen on, because right now we only have dedicated funding from the city of Atlanta. And as you can see under the gray box under the currently unfunded, we have no funds to continue on to Decatur or Avondale at this point, as we continue to work with DeKalb County on identifying these funds. So what that leaves the next steps for us. So one thing we will do, we will hold a virtual only meeting here in the next couple of months here to present to you which of the alternatives we will move forward. Again, as you saw earlier, the difference is really the ART or additional service going down to Decatur, if that continues to be viable. Once we do come back to you all after that virtual meeting, we will give you 30 days to comment on that alignment. So please make sure you be on the lookout for that. And then we will look to, at some point, right now we have it slated for May 2023 to go to the MARTA board for adoption. So that is what we're looking at this point. And so just so you know, we do have one more, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. We do have one more meeting. This is more of an open house style meeting that will be at the North Decatur Presbyterian Church on Metlock Road in Decatur. You can come there and ask questions. It won't be a formal presentation, but you can ask questions that you may have, or for those who have not been to the in-person formal meeting or this meeting here tonight, they can come and ask questions. So please tell them we will be out again Saturday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. to answer any questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Content.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for this great presentation. So now we are in the Q&A section of the program. Just as a reminder, you have your Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Click on it and you can type in your question. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can within this hour, and various subject matter experts will be prompted to jump in and add more specifics to questions based on their expertise. So with that, I'll get started and ask the first question. Would it be possible to briefly explain the acronyms BRT and ART? So Brian, can you? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we'll go back. We have a slide where we talked about what each mode actually entails. And so if you look here on this slide, ART and rapid transit, essentially the different characteristics, the guideway types, the difference really right now from a guideway type, you have dedicated right of way for light rail and bus rapid transit. So that's your BRT, LRT. ART is mixed traffic, typically in your current travel lanes. And as you can see, some typical peak frequencies between the two, 10 minutes or better for bus rapid transit or light rail, because we wanted that to mimic rail. So light rail and bus rapid transit are similar. From a standpoint of ART, it's on 15 minutes. That is still better than local bus service. So it is a much faster service. And then as well as the capacity, when you start talking capacity, light rail as well as bus rapid transit holds more people. We can move more people per hour, where you're moving fewer people with the arterial rapid transit, but again, more than your local bus service, as well as you can see the difference in the time frames.
Great, thank you for that answer. Okay, we have a question regarding the VA shuttle option. And the question is, are there initial designs for where or how the VA shuttle will connect to the BRT?
Yeah, so we've had some initial conversations. And so we're working with, obviously, we have to work with Emory on that because that does go through the heart of their campus. It goes through. So we've had conversations with Emory. There are a few options. It's not finalized at all. So we do have some ideas in working together with Emory about how that looks. And then we'll start talking to the VA as well about how that connection looks to them. So right now there are a few, we just will not narrow those things down until the next phase here.
Okay, the next question is regards to a long-term investment and why MARTA has chosen, or why the options that are being presented favor BRT versus light rail, and particularly focusing on the fact that the dedicated lane appears to only be a painted line to show protection, and historically, it doesn't work.
Okay. Yeah, so we talk about long-term investment. BRT is not, it's not a short-term investment in itself. You have to understand the BRT stations, these are robust stations. These are not bus shelters, and this is not infrastructure that you're just going to put in and one day decide, yeah, we're just going to take it out. It's a lot of money still goes into implementing a BRT system. So for the most part, it is a long-term investment when you're talking about putting BRT in. From a standpoint of infrastructure, again, the dedicated right of way, you did talk about that, and the painted line. Right now, yes, MARTA. Right now, we have not looking to implement a barrier at this point. However, we are working with legislatures and the jurisdictions to look at actual camera enforcement. We don't currently have camera enforcement on any of our service routes. And if you're looking at the light rail or the streetcar, that's something that a lot of people have talked about, but we are looking now to implement something of that nature. And we're talking with legislatures on that. So that will be one way we can potentially curb people from getting in lanes, in those dedicated lanes, by being fined. And so we'll continue to evaluate that, whether we need to implement a barrier at some point later in the future. Time will tell. If people just will not stay out the lane, then we may have to do something different. But BRT is a long-term investment as well.
Next question. Why was no action taken on previous recommended options for this corridor? Why should we expect any action to be taken on any future recommendations?
Yeah, I think the main difference here with this current analysis that we actually have funding. So if you really think about over the years, ever since all the way from 2012 or before, this project has not had funding. In the More MARTA program, the City of Atlanta's More MARTA program, there was dedicated funding provided to this project. So that does give it a much needed boost or an ability to move forward. Without funding, you can't move any of these alternatives forward. And so with that, we now have that ability. We also now have, we're having great conversations with the partner, CSX now. That wasn't happening before. So again, partners coming around, great partners coming around, as well as funding are the reason that these alternatives have not moved forward until now.
How will the buses be powered? Will they be electric, gas, overhead power? Please elaborate.
Yeah, so one thing that our CEO has made clear here, colleague Greenwood, Mr. Greenwood has made clear is that our BRT systems will be electric. And so that's the route we're going. Summerhill BRT will be electric. We're on this route, we are considering only electric. Now, this is not overhead wires, what you're thinking of a light rail system, which is electric. No, we're not thinking of that. These are battery powered vehicles that we're thinking.
Okay, here's a question in regards to the dedicated lanes. What is the impact on existing traffic in order to provide dedicated lanes?
Well, obviously you'll have some impact because you're now, if you're not, whether it depends also whether you're taking right away or whether you or adding additional right away. Obviously, there will be some impact because again, you're either narrowing the travel lanes or you're expanding them. Right now, what we intend to do, we are working on ridership models. We're working on traffic studies. And so some of those things we'll continue to work on. I don't know, Peter. Peter's on here as well. Peter's part of our project team with our consultant team. You want to chime in a little bit on that?
And sorry, Brian, specifically the question?
Yeah, specifically the question is around how will traffic be affected with BRT lanes, dedicated right-of-way lanes?
Sure. First of all, in the CSX corridor, that's not a concern because it's not an existing roadway. It's a railroad transportation corridor, and the conversation with CSX is to reserve half the width of that corridor for a dedicated transit way, and so no concerns there. In the eastern part of the corridor, where you would leave the railroad right-of-way and enter street right-of-way, conversations need to be ongoing for how to create those dedicated lanes. And the expectation is probably that the path forward is to maintain existing travel lanes and find a way still to provide dedicated transit lanes. There are places where it seems like there would not be a significant impact on traffic to reduce travel lanes and convert a travel lane to a dedicated transit lane. But there are other places where that would be a real challenge. So ongoing conversations for how to make that happen. I guess the other thing I would add is, alternative 1B that we're showing here right now, where a BRT vehicle would potentially, travel in the CSX corridor and then transition there at North Decatur Claremont to Claremont Avenue to approach Decatur in shared lanes. The path there in shared lanes is very similar to bus operations today. So, not an anticipated impact on traffic there, but ongoing conversations for how to provide those dedicated lanes in the eastern part of the BRT segment.
Thanks,
Peter, since we have you, can you explain how the buses will maneuver through traffic and their dedicated lanes to pick up passengers?
And Brian, you could address this one just as well, I'm sure. But no, a BRT vehicle doesn't need to leave its dedicated lane to pick up passengers. There would be new stations that are located in the roadway, potentially in the center of the roadway, an island station with good walk access to get to it. But the BRT vehicle would just pull right up to that station, is able to open all its doors at that station, let people on and off through every door. You pay before you board. No, you wouldn't have to leave that lane and somehow navigate through shared traffic to get over to a curbside stop. Nope, you would stay in that dedicated lane.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, another question. Dedicated lanes are extremely popular. Let's see if I can get this succinct. The concern is that dedicated lanes in the right of way can still cause a traffic jam. So assume the question is, when there's shared right of way, how is it possible to get a complete dedicated right of way?
So,
Probably not. Did you understand that question, Brian?
yeah, I think I understand. I'll say this. We're not, so if it's shared, there's no intent to get dedicated right away because it's going to be shared, in which we talked about the ART or additional service. We have no intent of trying to obtain any dedicated right away in that area. As Peter kind of mentioned, for the areas we do look at dedicated right away, whether we add additional travel lanes or whether we remove travel lanes for the dedication, that's how we would implement it. So I hope that answered the question, but and within
Brian, I can
Go
handle
ahead.
this one. Hello, everyone. My name is Sinan Sinharoy with the project team. I was starting to type an answer to this. I think I understand the question. So I think the question is about how can we get our shared or dedicated right of way for BRT up to from 97% up to 100%. So that 3% where we're looking at mixed traffic operations is close to the terminal stations on the Lindbergh end and the Avondale end. So we're looking at like a very short segment of mixed traffic on East Ponce, and then in the Lindbergh Center area where it's kind of difficult to get dedicated right of way. And we're trying to get as close as possible to those stations to make transfers easier for customers. So it's something we'll look into, but it's kind of tricky to get dedicated right of way near those near either end of the corridor.
Thanks, Sinan.
Okay, so apparently I asked the question wrong. And attendee would like to know if you can show on the map the areas where the shared right-of-way will be versus the dedicated lanes.
So around a terminus station here. So in this area, I mean, not the terminus, the beginning station here. And then your terminus in Avondale. This is where we're saying potential areas of where we'll have non-dedication, and then definitely here, this entire corridor here is non-dedicated. So right now, 3 points: Avondale, around Avondale, Lindbergh, and then the Decatur route.
Okay, I have a funding question. How do we get the remainder of the funding needed to implement?
Well, that's a good question. There are multiple ways that funding can be obtained. One, which we all know, you can do a referendum and bring in funding that way. Via the state law, you can bring in funding with a referendum. The other ways, you got grants. You do have grants, transportation grants, and things of that nature, and you also have just local funds in general. So there are a number of ways you can get more funding. You just have to figure out what's the best route for that. And I think that's something the CAB is currently looking at. And so we'll continue to support them in that effort. And that's where the additional funding will come from.
Here's a question in regards to communications and education. So can you explain how MARTA will educate and inform riders about bus rapid transit? Is it going to be the normal bus information or will show up on the train network maps?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll talk a little bit about, the onboard systems or the systems that you will see. And then I'll let Greg, Japita, talk a little bit about, communications, because we do have some out there now. But as far as communicating to the public about this service, yes, this is a brand new service. Again, that should mimic rail when you talk about BRT. So everything you see with our BRT system from a communication standpoint, we want to mimic what we do for our heavy rail system or our streetcar system, where arrival times, on-time arrival times, and so forth. This is intended to be a premium service when we talk about BRT. And Greg, I don't know if you want to talk about the education piece, which we do have some stuff out there now.
Sure. I think a lot of the examples you're going to see on this will come first with our Summerhill Bus Rapid Transit project that we're building from downtown to Peoplestown neighborhood. When we launch a new service, we go through a whole system activation plan where we come up with, we will have new wayfinding. We will add it to all of our materials in the system to make sure that it's well integrated with heavy rail and our local buses. There is going to be, in the near future, next couple of years, we're going to be upgrading all of our technology as far as fare collection and mobile apps. And so all of this new service would be integrated with that. So we really see all of these BRT projects as becoming part of our high capacity network, and all of the customer facing experience will show that.
That's great.
Thanks.
I have a question regarding the ridership analysis. So will the projected ridership include passengers that transfer to existing rail lines at Lindbergh and Avondale?
Yeah, so typically the way ridership analysis works, we did the onboard survey, which is our current ridership survey, particularly heavy rail and our other services. But yes, it does include the riders who transfer and so forth. We try to account for all of that all the way up to the year 2040. So yes, it's not a short answer.
Okay. So not sure if you guys can see this or not, but we have over 60 questions in the queue. So, and to be perfectly honest, it's extremely difficult to decide which ones to elevate. So if there are team members that can assist me with that, it would be greatly appreciated. Next question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, forgive me, we had a couple of questions regarding just the potential for bike facilities and other pedestrian facilities as a part of this project, whether in the western segment or the eastern segment. I wonder if we could speak about that for a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah. And so, we're always open and trying to figure out, are there ways to make sure that this is a true transportation corridor? So we are looking at, where we can implement bike trails or, bike paths that are adjacent to the corridor. One thing we want to do is we want to prevent, those who ride bikes and other motorized vehicles and things within the transit lanes. So the best way to do that is to look for areas where we could implement some next to or adjacent to the system. So we are looking at that. That will be refined and that will be identified in the next phase, because we really need to narrow down what we are going to implement in order to start to basically go out and look for areas we can implement bike lanes and so forth.
Here's a question in regards to BRT and its draw of potential riders. Can you explain why the project believes that BRT will attract riders from Emory and greater Decatur area?
This is a regional project. While we will attract, riders from the Emory, Decatur area, it's actually, this area encompasses people who come from all over the region. And this gives those who don't have a vehicle an option to travel in this area. And then this also gives to come and get the services and needs that they may have. This also, those employees, same difference. They come to this area to work. They don't have to drive. Those choice riders. If you don't have to sit in traffic for hours, you can ride a 30-minute bus ride or a BRT ride. It makes life that much more easier. So when you start talking about, yes, the Emory and Decatur riders using this, but you're also talking about a regional. You talk about people from Atlanta, from Gwinnett, from Cobb, from South, Clayton, Henry, and so forth. You get a lot of people come to this area who don't live in this area, and then there's those who don't have cars.
Here's a good question about transit-oriented development. So since MARTA is definitely focused on creating transit-oriented development, is it considering doing it at these new stations? And if so, how will this option be executed through, private investment?
Yeah, so we are definitely looking at TOD for our station areas. I think Jacob Vallow and his team does a great job of implementing TODs for MARTA around our stations, and this corridor is no different. We are anticipating that our team, Jacob's team, will continue that in the Clifton area on the stations where it is appropriate and work with developer community as well as local government on implementing those. So yeah, that is definitely a part of this project.
Will there be parking at these stations?
So as it currently stands, the only parking, these are intended to be walk-up stations. The only parking right now that we are identifying, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, is Lindbergh, if I'm not touching all of them, but Lindbergh, where we already have parking, and then the Avondale station, where parking would be considered as well.
And I would say that going to look at every opportunity, particularly in the Eastern Corridor, DeKalb Industrial Way, for example. There may be opportunities to provide some more parking there to capture some of that traffic coming in from the Northeast. Potentially some remote parking for institutions that could then access this system to get to the big job centers and service centers. But lots of structured parking at Lindbergh, some at Avondale, and looking for additional opportunities. But most of the stations are walk-up and transit-oriented development stations, and that's sort of the highest and best use of the property, is to build as much and to have the area around the stations be as walkable and bikeable as possible.
Okay, I have a question from a North Decatur Road resident. They'd like to know, where will the land come from to create a dedicated lane on North Decatur Road?
Yeah, so we're still evaluating what that looks like. One idea that we do have is that we can do a reversible lane, a single lane, where there'll be signals where the bus stops for the one approaching for the approach. So there's some options there. Peter, I don't think anything's off the table at the moment, but that's one of the options that we are considering on North Decatur Road.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, so that reversible lane option, it's something we're exploring to make sure that we've got enough capacity to operate, the service that's demanded. But haven't seen anything that tells us that that's off the table yet. So, it's currently a 4-lane configuration today. And there's an ongoing project that's a City of Decatur project with other partners to explore how to address non-motorized safety and mobility in the corridor, and to address some drainage issues. A lot of times, a roadway like that with 4 lanes, you get conflicts if somebody's wanting to make a left turn, for example, and they'll be paused for a long time in that left side lane to make a left turn, and then traffic sort of backs up as it tries to, navigate its way over to the right lane to get around that. One common solution is to develop a sort of calm traffic environment that keeps flowing, but would have like a center reversible lane for traffic. That's something probably a lot of us have seen in different places. Well, maybe that centered left turn lane could be the dedicated transit lane instead, with other options for in certain places, traffic to be able to turn left and make a left turn. But lots of different options being explored currently under a separate project in that corridor. And we certainly look to coordinate with that project.
Yeah, and then again, you just mentioned that project, Peter. That's one we've attended a meeting or two with that, and we'll continue to coordinate with Decatur on that. So yeah, thanks, Peter.
There's a question regarding the ART proposal. Why do we need ART between North Decatur and Decatur? Why not just go Howard Avenue and Commerce Drive between Avondale and Decatur?
Well, the most direct route there right now, and Peter, maybe you guys want to chime in, but we heard, from a standpoint of the most direct route right now, that looks like the best option at this time. We're still evaluating that area again. That's not set in stone that we'll implement that. That's why we're still carrying the 2 alternatives. But we'll continue to look and see if that makes the most sense. But we do know additional ridership was wanted at Decatur Station, and that gives you an opportunity to do that coming off North Decatur Road.
And the commenter asked the question about Howard Avenue. That alignment does use part of Commerce Drive. Howard Avenue, I would have to get more familiar with.
Yeah.
Can you explain, I guess, MARTA's typical acquisition process, particularly, along North Decatur, with it being considerable amount of residential properties? How will homeowners be compensated for, in order to move this project forward?
So one, we're not certain that any homes will be taken on North Decatur. We have options still right now that we're evaluating. So that's not a guarantee that anything of that nature is going to take place, because we still have evaluations to do in that area. But when it does come to when MARTA does need to obtain right-of-way of such, we follow the FTA process. And so the FTA process is, we follow strictly, and essentially there's fair compensation and so forth with that. So we don't deviate from the FTA process. You can look that up. I don't know if one of the team members want to drop property acquisition from the FTA in the chat, but that's how we will go about it if we needed to take any types of property.
Stephanie Roberts, might you be available to address how property acquisition is considered in the environmental process?
Sure. Hi, good evening. As part of the environmental process, MARTA is required to do what's called a real estate management plan. And in that plan, what MARTA does is looks at the properties that will be impacted by the project to see if there would be either partial or full takes or property acquisition. But the ramp, what is well, that what is it called? The ramp also looks at the type of property and if there are similar properties. For instance, if there's a small commercial business that may be impacted and would be a full take, MARTA would go and see if there are similar properties in the nearby areas to try to limit the disruption as much as possible. MARTA also has a right-of-way acquisition team that, as Brian says, does follow the federal rules and regulations regarding property acquisition. It must be fair and equitable. There are several rules about, making sure that people are given just payment for their property. When the environmental document for this project does come out, that technical report is part of it and does have all of the rules and regulations and requirements as appendices to that part of it. And we can also provide the link to FTA's rules as well.
Stephanie, forgive me, do you mind explaining a little bit just a full take versus a partial take? Because I think that's an important distinction.
Sure, thanks, Greg. So a partial take is when part of the property is taken, but the property owner still can utilize that property. For instance, if there's just maybe 2-3 feet of a corner of a property that is taken, that's considered a partial take. A full take is considered when MARTA would take enough of the property that either, we take a complete driveway and you don't have access to get to your house or to your store, or we would take part of the actual building. That's considered a full take. So essentially, if the property is still operational in a meaningful way, so it's not like, oh, well, you still have one door, you used to have 3 doors, that's not a meaningful way. So as long as the property is still used in a way that is acceptable to the property owner, that's considered a partial take. And a full take is when the owner and MARTA come to the conclusion that the property cannot be utilized in the way that it was previously.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Next question. Is there a study that determines the number of potential drivers that are converted to now a transit rider?
There's studies. Pierre, you want to take that one? I don't.
That's how do we anticipate how many riders there will be?
Yeah.
We do have a subject matter expert on the meeting here who is doing the demand analysis for us. Chris, would you like to speak briefly about how you anticipate some drivers might turn into transit riders?
Sure, it's a great question, and that's actually a metric that the stops model we're using spits out. So in terms of the transit ridership estimation or the forecasting, we're not only estimating trips that are already made from transit, right? We're also estimating sort of those trips that are coming from folks that are currently driving or taking other modes. I think just qualitatively, I saw the question and I took a quick glance at some of our preliminary numbers, and we're seeing, I think, conservatively 20 to 30% of the ridership numbers are represented by folks who would be new to transit ridership. So I hope that answers the question. And that's actually a metric that FDA is interested in as well. So.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm sorry, looking for a question that has not been answered. We have a property owner on Arnold Avenue where the CXX line runs right behind their house. When would you, oh goodness, where'd the question go? I think the question had to do with construction. When do you expect construction along? When would you expect construction to occur?
So right now, as the Moore MARTA plan has laid out, Clifton is anticipated to go into operation 2031. As you may know, we are, right now with us being focused on the city of Atlanta, we are negotiating with the mayor on those priorities, essentially having conversations with the mayor on where those things lie. That 2031 number is based on light rail. So we anticipate that we can build this BRT route faster, as you saw in our timeframes. So that time frame we would anticipate and look to move that time frame up. And so now you're talking less, 2 or 3 years less than what we already anticipated. So if you're looking for operations in that standpoint, so you can anticipate when construction would be around that time frame. Can't give you a definite at this point because we're too far out. But as we continue to move forward in the next phase, we'll start to, tease that out and let people know what we're thinking from a construction standpoint.
Can you reiterate when we'll have the single recommendation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now we're anticipating coming back to you all with the single recommendation in March. We just have a few more things we want to vet with regards to the additional route down to Decatur. And so before we make a decision on whether we will do something down that route, we will come back to you all and let you guys know before we send it to the board. And then get your comments as well.
Yeah, have we looked at installing curbed raised medians to separate the lanes as opposed to striping or bollards as barriers?
Yeah, we consider, and even on Summerhill, we've considered, how could you prevent others from getting into the lane or other vehicles from getting into the lanes, but you also have got to consider getting our vehicles out if a vehicle happens to get stuck in the lane or a breakdown of some sort. Also, can medical vehicles get through? Because again, that is a dedicated lane that should be free of any other vehicles. So you start to weigh in all of the different aspects of what you could do with a dedicated lane. And so right now we opt to not put anything. Again, that doesn't mean in the future, if we're seeing it not working, you can't come back and put something there from a barrier standpoint or a curbable where you can jump the curve type barrier. But that is the reason right now we're just at this point, we haven't decided not to go with any barrier.
Yeah, here's another, converting riders question, converting car drivers to transit riders question. Can you explain a little bit more about the approach to how you can increase or plan to increase ridership for the corridor, but across the entire MARTA system as well?
Yeah, I mean, really the only way you're going to get choice riders back onto the system or increase the choice riders is continue to build out corridors and corridors where people want to go and make sure the system goes where people want to go. You can market. I mean, you're going to be marketing. We'll continue to market our system. We'll continue to build just based on public feedback and based on where people want to go. I mean, it's something every transit agency in the country is dealing with. And so all transit agencies are, finding unique ways to bring riders back. And we'll continue to do that because we do want to have choice riders choose to ride MARTA. And I don't know, Greg, if anybody else have anything on that, but I'll leave it at that.
Another question regarding TOD. So since you previously stated that the new stations will consider having TOD developed there, will there be height or size requirements or limits set to make sure that it's in sync with the scale of the residential community surrounding it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now we don't, so, when we go and implement TODs or any type of other building out there, we still follow code of the local jurisdiction. I would think that, if there was some variances they're given of some sort, there would be notice of that, but typically you follow, the local code on heights and things of that nature. So zoning is important in those areas.
Will the public be able to provide input for design options on the on any of the sections as once the recommendation has been identified?
I would have, I guess I'm not quite sure.
So is there a public input process around design?
Now, if we're talking, or not around the actual alignment and the engineering piece, but typically we do from time to time get a public opinion on artwork and things of that nature that may be incorporated into stations and things and into the area, but highly unlikely the actual engineering design of we'll be using input for, but the other areas we could consider it. That's typically what we do.
And Brian, maybe I can just chime in on that. During the environmental process and design phases, design concepts will be shown to the public at different points through that process. And there's certainly an opportunity to comment at those times.
Team members, do you see any other questions that we can uplift?
Yeah, I think we had one question here regarding capacity of BRT. Does BRT really have the capacity to serve 50% or so of the daily commute jobs traffic into the Emory CDC employment node? And if we could, if we haven't already, speak to the capacity of BRT.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it does have the capacity. It's about operations, and the team can speak to this as well, but it's really about operations. The number of buses we really need to run to meet a certain capacity. Similar to light rail, we would do the same thing with light rail, how many trains we need to run. So we would do, go ahead.
I was going to say, Brian, could you take us back to the slide comparing the modes, which I think had some of that information?
Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, so again, it's we would do the same thing we would with light rail, basically, when it comes to riders and how many we can fit within an hour per hour. So as you can see here, it just depends on the operations, which we will get into in a much deeper dive here in the next phase.
And there was a question if other forms of transportation, particularly pedestrians and wheeled vehicles like skaters and cyclists, could this future design incorporate them or their utilization as a part of this process?
Yeah, that's kind of what I mentioned earlier about we'll continue to evaluate areas where we can include design that allows for other vehicles, or not vehicles, other modes of transportation, bikes, scooters, things of that nature, to be adjacent to or along in the corridor in the area. So we'll continue to look at that, but that is a part of what we look at, and just depends on the area we're in and the right of way we may have.
Hey, Brian, I wonder if I can just step in for just a moment on this capacity question and ask if Chris Johnson can perhaps help out with this. But I believe that this capacity information that we're showing here is how many riders each transit mode can carry in each direction. So I believe if you're considering, service traveling in both directions, it's double these numbers. Chris Johnson, are you able to confirm that? Am I misreading that?
I think that's probably a safe assumption, Peter. I don't have the op plan in front of me to confirm it 100%, but I think that seems very familiar to me. So I would be comfortable with that response.
So 750.
And so, some of our subject matter experts have been responding to the questions in the Q&A with type responses.
Yeah.
Um,
Got a couple more here. Forgive me, I'm kind of trying to keep up here, so I haven't heard every response in detail. Did we discuss how BRT stations will be different from local bus stops?
Not in detail, but a little bit. But BRT stations are full-fledged stations, similar to what our streetcar stations look like. However, we will have real-time wayfinding there. We will have, in some areas, we will have the ticket fare machines. It is not a shelter. I don't know if we've put the Summerhill BRT stations out publicly yet, but if you've seen renderings of the Summerhill BRT stations, those are BRT stations. They're not shelters at all, and so they're permanent fixtures for the most part. I don't know if I don't have a picture of one.
Brian,
Yeah,
I wonder if I can bring out just one special feature of a BRT station.
Mhm.
I mentioned when I was talking earlier about stations, how every door can open up as you arrive at a station. And the expectation is there would probably be doors on both sides of the BRT vehicle. So it can pull up on either, the station can either be on the left or the right side of the BRT vehicle. But when all those doors open, the expectation is that each of those doors, there would be an opportunity for a wheelchair, for example, to just roll right on and off, not a need for a mechanical lift for that loading. The time, what's referred to as the dwell time at the station, how long it takes for the bus to be stopped at the station, let everybody off, let everybody on, and have fares taken care of, happens in seconds, where some busy regular bus stops where people queue up to put their cash in the fare box, for example, it can take several minutes. That's one of the big advantages of a BRT station. But it will look like a rail station with nice signature, shelters, marketing. It'll stand out. You'll know it's there.
Thanks, Pierre.
How will the plan affect Emory University students?
Well, as you can see, it will obviously, for us, it will hopefully more students will ride the service. Again, on the one thing I think we didn't bring out for the most, we didn't really talk more about, but we are looking to touch the heavy rail line on both sides when this is built out fully. Obviously, the gold and red lines will be touched during the first phase of this, and then hopefully in the next phase, the blue and green line. So, hopefully more students will ride. There may be opportunities for MARTA and Emory to do similar what we do with other universities with regards to students and how it's paid for and how the passes and things of that nature. So, there's some positive impacts here for students that we anticipate.
There are quite a few attendees that currently ride the number 6. And they wanted to know if BRT will be a lot more reliable than the current number 6 bus.
Yeah, and the key there is that is local bus service, which is in mixed traffic, which has to fight the elements to get where it needs to go. Again, we're talking BRT, we're talking dedicated lanes, so there is no need to fight traffic. There's no need to fight the other elements that you would have to in a local bus service. So it would be much more reliable than our local bus service because of the dedicated right-of-way.
Whole lot faster too.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure off the top, for example, how long it would take to get from the Lindbergh station area to Emory and the CDC on a local bus, but I'm sure that takes a little bit of time. We know that driving end to end is taking an hour and 15 minutes in the peak hour, right? We can double check the numbers. Somebody can correct me, but it's less than 15 minutes to travel from Lindbergh to the Clifton station near Emory along the CSX corridor. And maybe somebody has specific numbers, but it's between 10 and 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, Peter, we're looking at between 8 and 10 minutes for that Lindbergh to Clifton section.
Pretty impactful.
Believe the frequency numbers that you provided are focused on peak. What about off-peak?
Yeah, so off-peak operating plan, Peter, you want to talk, do we want to talk what we currently have in off-peak from an operating standpoint?
Sure, and Chris, feel free to correct me, but with BRT, the plan is to, in the peak, run at least every 10 minutes along the, end-to-end Lindbergh to Avondale segment. And if you add service between Lindbergh and Decatur, it will increase the frequency of service in that shared corridor along the CSX alignment, for example. Off-peak BRT service, the expectation is probably every 15 minutes, and probably on an ART segment, I think what we assumed was every 20 minutes in the off-peak. And that branch to Decatur, the way we've been analyzing it so far is assuming every 15 minutes during the peak periods.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent with what we're looking for on Summerhill. Again, this is to mimic rail. So if you think about rail service, you should think of that's how we operate BRT. And here.
Can you clarify, are the BRT dedicated lanes planned to be used by first responders as well?
So that's something we've discussed. A lot of times first responders, they do get stuck in traffic as well when they're trying to get to a call. And I think that's something we're exploring. And that comes into play when we start talking about barriers. And so that's something we're exploring as we continue to move this forward, that first responders having the ability to get through traffic if we're, not in their way as well to utilize the lanes. Haven't made a decision on that, but that's something we do explore.
Brian, we had a question here, I think, asking about why alternative 2 was not considered for a route directly into Decatur. And I believe we had one of those alternatives that was previously ruled out in the first screen. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple with that question. We're already at $2.3 to $2.4 billion with just light rail to Avondale. So if you add another leg of this for LRT, you continue to go higher from the cost. And so again, cost effectiveness, it doesn't do it any good from a cost effectiveness standpoint. Peter, you got anything on that as well? I mean, that's, you know.
So we also had a lot of discussion in the previous round about how there was not community support for widening the right-of-way along Claremont Avenue, through Decatur. And so how could you provide a branch like that with LRT or BRT? Either the conclusion was you needed to have more right-of-way to have dedicated lanes in that portion because it's a heavily trafficked, area. And mature trees, historic homes along the corridor, there was not support for widening right-of-way. How else can you do it? Well, maybe you can build a subway. There's not the anticipation of the level of demand to justify the cost of building a subway in that portion. That's the most capital intensive form of public transit, is to build underground, especially underground stations. So weren't seeing the cost effectiveness there.
Brian, can we please move the slide up to, I guess, either 1A or 1B? And just wanted to make one final point on that and then wrap up for tonight. We're at 8 o'clock. I think it's also important to note, maybe Peter or Brian can weigh in on all of the additional destinations that are served by the Avondale terminus, as far as community institutions, healthcare facilities, housing, all of those things. And then we'll wrap it up.
You want to go ahead, Peter?
Well, that Avondale branch serves the Emory Decatur Hospital, of course, grocery stores, mixed-use residential neighborhoods. There's a VA clinic along DeKalb Industrial. There's the farmers market. New developments and services on the opposite side of the tracks there at Avondale. Lots of services served by that branch, and of course to have that really reliable and fast service even during peak hours connecting to the Blue Line.
Thank you. With that, Content, would you like to close us out?
Would like to again thank you all for joining us this evening and taking time out of your day to join us on this very important subject. As a reminder, we are having our in-person open house on this coming Saturday at North Decatur Presbyterian Church. We invite you all to come out. We'll have maps and boards on display with information and plenty of subject matter experts there to address your questions. Also note that this evening's presentation and Q&A session has been recorded, and it will be accessible via the MARTA YouTube channel for you to view again. Thank you so much for your participation. We look forward to seeing you on this Saturday and in future meetings. All right. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.